On a wet February night in 2016, a slippery trail led out of an empty tank at the National Aquarium in Napier, New Zealand. Staff found a loose pipe, a wet footprint on the concrete, and the sea just a few meters away. They named him Inky. The story sounded like a prank, but it sparked a question that is quietly driving a revolution in biology. How clever can an 8-armed alien in our oceans actually be? For most of modern history, octopuses were curiosities tucked into the margins of marine science, described as solitary, short-lived, and driven by instinct. People working on docks and in fish markets treated them as bizarre mollusks with no family ties and little inner life. The staple picture was the common octopus, Octopus vulgaris, in bait shops and on dinner plates, or the cold, dark dens of the giant Pacific octopus, Enteroctopus duflini, off the waters of Puget Sound. The story began to shift as naturalists and neuroscientists started taking these animals seriously. In the mid-20th century, John Z. Young mapped cephalopod brains and helped set the stage for thinking about complex neural architectures. In the lab, optic gland experiments in the 1970s revealed a brutal truth about reproduction. Female octopuses often brood over their eggs without eating and undergo a hormonal cascade that leads to death. That finding is commonly traced to classic optic gland work from that era. At the same time, field biologists were seeing behavior that did not fit the old mold. In 1998, Mark Norman and Richard Hochberg described the mimic octopus, Thaumaoctopus mimicus, in Indonesian shallows, and those early dives were full of surprises. Then the genome era added another layer. In 2015, Albertine and colleagues released a draft octopus genome that revealed massive expansions of gene families and extensive RNA editing, changes that could help build novel neural networks. Today, the numbers that get mentioned most often are startling. Octopuses can have on the order of 500 million neurons, and a majority of those neurons are not concentrated in a single brain, but are distributed through arm ganglia. The vertical lobe stands out as a learning center, and labs from Hebrew University to Woods Hole have shown it supports neural plasticity. The stage was set. We still treated octopuses as oddities on our taxonomic tree, but their unusual hardware and the first hints of rich behavior made researchers start listening for a very different story. That listening led straight to the first big surprises. The first shock came from simple scenes on tropical sand flats and in quiet laboratories. In 2009, Julian Finn and Mark Norman published and filmed a behavior off the coasts of Sulawesi and nearby Indonesian waters that looked like a toolbox handed to an animal. The veined or coconut octopus Amphiooctopus marginatus was seen carrying coconut shells and half-shells across the seabed and assembling them into a portable shelter. The video is tactile and immediate. Pale shells clutched in webbed arms, the octopus moving like a small mammal across a featureless plain, then tucking itself into a shell as if pulling a hood up against a storm. The action suggested planning and foresight, not reflexive hiding. Then there were the jar tests in labs that became almost folklore. Researchers from Naples to La Jolla put crabs inside glass jars and watched Octopus vulgaris and other species open lids or manipulate complex closures to get at the food. The lights of the laboratory hum, water sloshes in tanks, and a grad student in a lab coat notes how one animal returns to the same technique day after day. Only a few years earlier, Giacomo Fiorito and P. Scotto had published work showing observational learning in Octopus vulgaris at the Stazione Zoologica in Naples. They trained one animal, let another watch, and the observer learned the trick without trial and error. That is a different kind of intelligence because it depends on representing the actions of another individual. The drama went public with stories like Inky's escape from Napier Aquarium and Paul the Octopus, a 2010 celebrity at the Sea Life Center in Oberhausen who seemed to predict soccer matches. Paul was a spectacle and a mirror for human projections, but Inky and the field footage demanded a deeper answer. Scientists began to argue in lab meetings and at conferences from Woods Hole to Sydney. Was this tool use and planning, or just a sequence of motor patterns? Could distributed arm ganglia account for the dexterity we saw? And crucially, could these behaviors spread between individuals? If so, something like culture might be possible. The tension built because the evidence was vivid but ambiguous, and the next phase of research had to ask harder, more rigorous questions. The next wave of research pushed beyond tricks and entered territory that looked more like social life and communication. Roger Hanlon at the Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole had been recording the flashes and textures of cephalopod skin for decades, and his footage reads like a language study. Chromatophores flare, iridophores glitter, leucophores settle into patterns, and the animal seems to be speaking with color. When Hanlon and his team filmed a courting octopus cyanea in Hawaiian reefs or a territorial octopus tetrachus in Australian kelp, the displays were consistent, repeatable, and clearly aimed at someone else. Cameras hummed, divers held their breath, and the interplay of white patches and rapid blotching looked less like camouflage and more like grammar. In the field, Peter Godfrey Smith recounts in his 2016 book Other Minds how on bay dives off southeastern Australia, he watched octopuses posture and flash information to each other or to human observers. There are even reports of male tactics in which smaller males approach females while minimizing the appearance of their reproductive arms to avoid detection by larger rivals. The idea that octopuses might deceive or signal implies social strategies not previously credited to them. Meanwhile, laboratory work by Jennifer Mather and colleagues on temperament gave the animals individuality. Mather at the University of Lethbridge cataloged bold and shy personalities that persisted across tests. A particular octopus would consistently explore novel objects. Another would hide and avoid bright lights. Those patterns matter because if individuals consistently behave differently, social interactions can take on stable dynamics. Observational learning, personality, and signaling combined into an uncomfortable conclusion for many biologists. In Italian tanks, on Indonesian sand flats, and in Australian kelp beds, it seemed behaviors could be copied and repeated. That raised a word that makes ethicists sit up: culture. Could shell carrying be a local tradition in a population? Could den arrangements or hunting styles be socially transmitted? The idea sat uneasily with the octopus life history. Their lifespans are short. Many species live a year or two, and females die after brooding. But the debate intensified as aggregation behaviors cropped up in places like Jervis Bay, and anecdotal reports kept arriving of den complexes with many individuals in proximity. The stakes rose. The question was no longer can octopuses solve problems, but could they build and pass on ways of living? By then, the tension had sharpened into a confrontation: brains versus behavior. The octopus brain is a study in evolutionary ingenuity, but it is not built like ours. In labs in Jerusalem, Benjamin Hochner and his team wired electrodes into the vertical lobe and demonstrated synaptic plasticity consistent with a memory mechanism. Stas Sumbri and colleagues recorded arm motor programs and showed astonishing autonomy in peripheral ganglia. An octopus arm can grasp without moment-by-moment central commands, and the arms together hold massive numbers of neurons. The whole animal often ends up with on the order of 500 million neural cells. The 2015 genome paper by Albertine et al., published in Nature, made it clear that cephalopods evolved neural complexity along different genetic routes than vertebrates, with expansions of protocaterin and zinc finger gene families and an unusual prevalence of RNA editing. While neuroscientists were wiring and imaging and geneticists were sequencing, field biologists kept bringing back stories of social interactions, tool use, and complex mating strategies. The more data that arrived, the worse the fit with old categories became. An urgent question emerged: could a distributed nervous system produce subjective experience? Could short-lived animals with such different architecture nonetheless hold preferences, memories, fears, and possibly culture? The debate spilled into public view. The EU had already recognized cephalopods in Directive 2010, so researchers in Europe found themselves operating under animal welfare rules for the first time. Labs in the United States, Australia, and Japan started updating ethical protocols, and grant panels began to ask for animal welfare statements. It felt like standing on the edge of an intellectual cliff. Evidence piled up, but so did counter-arguments. Some scientists stressed the need for caution and pointed to convergent mechanisms as a possible explanation. Others argued a synthesis was inevitable, that we were simply learning to read very different minds. The turning point wasn't a single paper so much as a confluence of moments that made the scientific community take a collective breath. In 2015, the octopus genome, Octopus bimaculoides, mapped out much of the molecular machinery, and around 2016, viral stories and images, Inky's escape, coconut-carrying behavior, and striking cases of mimicry, captured the public imagination. At the same time, Peter Godfrey Smith published Other Minds, a careful book that stitched together field observation, lab neuroscience, and philosophical reflection. The conversation that followed reframed the question from, can octopuses do tricks, to, what does it mean to have a mind that evolved on a separate branch of life? The immediate practical consequences arrived fast. Labs that had treated octopuses as simple invertebrates suddenly faced ethics review boards and new animal care plans. Field researchers who once cleared dens or collected specimens now needed permits to minimize disturbance. Funding agencies began prioritizing projects aimed at the big questions about consciousness and social transmission. Picture a wet lab at night, the hum of filters, an electrode over a vertical lobe, and a diver on a reef catching the shimmer of a chromatophore display, and in both places the same thought forming. What does this animal feel? It was a cultural pivot, not a final verdict. We had enough evidence to make the old dismissals untenable and enough uncertainty to make the next decade of research urgent. The ripple effects are practical and ethical in equal measure. Since the mid-2010s, governments, institutions, and funding bodies have treated cephalopods differently. In the EU, cephalopods, including octopuses, were added to Directive 2010/63, and other countries have followed with increased oversight. Aquariums changed their exhibitions, and some fisheries began to face public pressure to consider welfare. For science, the impact has been a surge of projects, mapping the octopus connectomy, testing social learning in the field, and comparing decision-making across distributed nervous systems. There is now a quiet revolution in how we ask about minds. We used to look for creatures like us. Now we are learning to recognize minds that are strikingly not like ours. That matters because it changes how we act toward them. It changes laws, fishing nets, and laboratory cages, but maybe more importantly, it changes a habit of thought. We can no longer assume consciousness is a human-shaped thing. If an octopus carries a coconut, if Inky finds a drain at midnight, if a female broods until death driven by the optic gland deep in her head, then the secret social lives of octopuses are no longer just anecdotes. They become urgent clues about how minds evolve and about how we should live in a world that includes very different kinds of knowing.